demo debate. Today we're going to be using a 1v1 modified debate Lincoln Douglas debate format, and we'll be discussing the marijuana affirmative, which is for use in the Atlanta Urban Debate League's varsity division. So the marijuana affirmative, just to give you a preview of the debate's content, has two advantages. And remember, in the type of debate we do, the affirmative is going to propose a plan. And the plan here is to legalize marijuana, is to remove it from the Controlled Substances Act. The advantages, the reasons, the benefits of that policy are that creating a domestic marijuana industry will lessen demand for marijuana from the Mexican drug cartels. The second is that increasing tax revenue during the current pandemic is a must. So if we create the marijuana industry, then that tax revenue can be used to help the United States recover economically. Now, the marijuana negative is a little bit different from what you might have seen in a previous demo debate, in that the varsity division has options. So there are two disadvantages. There's a pharmaceuticals disadvantage. A disadvantage is an argument about the negative consequences of the plan. The pharmaceutical disadvantage says, hey, there are potential trade-offs if we reduce demand for prescription drugs. There's also a federalism disadvantage about the balance of power between the states and federal government. There's a critique that questions the philosophical assumptions of the plan that's related to prison abolition. And then there's a counterplan or an alternative policy proposal where the negative can argue that the state government should legalize marijuana as opposed to the federal government. So the format of today's debate will also be a little bit different than what you may be used to. It'll be a modified 1v1 Lincoln Douglas debate. That means shorter speech times and less speeches. There will be a 5-minute constructive from each side, a 1 AC, first affirmative constructive, and a 1 NC. You'll also have a 5-minute rebuttal from the negative, so the 1 NR, the first negative rebuttal. And then for the affirmative, they have that same 5 minutes, but split up into two speeches, a first affirmative rebuttal and a second affirmative rebuttal. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to our affirmative debater, who will give us the first affirmative constructive, which is a 5-minute speech. Take it away.
Greetings. Today I propose the following plan. The United States federal government should remove marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act. Contention 1 is inherency. Despite state legalization, marijuana is legal under federal law. This comes from LAMP in 2020. Notwithstanding state laws, any activity involving marijuana that is not authorized under the CSA remains a federal crime. When states legalize a federally controlled substance, the result is that the substance is no longer controlled under state law. Activities that violate the CSA may give rise to federal criminal prosecution. Contention 2 is solvency. First, federal prohibition critically undermines the economic viability of the marijuana industry. Legalization is necessary to prevent collapse. This comes from Burdig in 2019. When state and federal laws are in conflict, federal law takes precedence. The most widespread problems facing the cannabis industry are commerce and capital, areas in which the federal government holds sway. Federal taxes can be a huge burden. Federal tax code still classifies cannabis farmers as drug traffickers. This drastically limits what business expenses they can write off on federal tax returns, and without changes at the federal level fairly soon, the state cannabis industry cannot thrive. Second, the current boom will go bust. Legalization is necessary to save the industry. This comes from Eckfeld in 2020. While the cannabis market has been booming, it's still a fiercely competitive space with many companies struggling. Capital markets are going to take a while to recover, leaving many businesses starving for cash. Because THC cannabis is still federally illegal, these companies are not eligible for the PPP and loan programs designed to aid recovery. Contention 3 is the cartel's advantage. First, Mexico is on the brink of collapse. Cartel violence is escalating. This comes from Elves in 2020. Cartels seek to avoid the state. When these avenues fail, cartels will challenge and confront the state with military-like force, overwhelming both police and legal systems. Conflict has resulted in the deaths of 200,000 people. This situation shows no signs of slowing down, and April 2020 has been the deadliest yet. Second, studies prove marijuana legalization solves cartel violence. This comes from Doward in 2018. According to the study, when a state on the Mexican border legalized medical use of marijuana, violent crime fell by 13% on average. Most marijuana consumed in the US originates in Mexico, where cartels control the illicit drug trade. Local farmers are in direct competition with Mexican cartels that are smuggling the marijuana into the US. As a result, the cartels get much less business. When the effect is so significant, it's obviously better to regulate marijuana and allow people to pay taxes on it rather than making it illegal. Third, state collapse risk cascading negative consequences, including conflict and terrorism. This comes from Kaplan in 2017. The risks from fragile states are hard to assess because their most important components are often second, third, or even later order effects that combine to create a large impact. Risk cascades are particularly important in fragile states because the social and institutional fabric is susceptible to relatively mild shocks or stresses that would not harm more resilient systems. Fragile states can transmute their instability across borders. Conflict spreads from country to country. In particular, Latin American failed states risk multiple existential threats. This comes from Manwaring in 2005. State failure is the most dangerous security challenge facing the global community. Failed state status is the breeding ground for instability, criminality, insurgency, regional conflict, and terrorism. These breed massive humanitarian disasters. These means of coercion can spawn proliferation of conventional weapons systems and WMD, genocide, ethnic cleansing, warlordism, and criminal anarchy. These actions are usually unconfined and spill over into regional syndromes of poverty, destabilization, and conflict. Contention 4 is the economy advantage. First, the economic recovery has stalled and we're on the brink of recession now. This comes from Egan in July of 2020. Economists say there's nothing to debate. The recovery is faltering. 22 states have reversed or paused their reopening. The recent surge has raised concerns that a more likely scenario is that the COVID-19 recession has not bottomed out. Economic indicators suggest concerns are warranted. Specifically, government stimulus is necessary to prevent a double dip collapse. This comes from Zandi in 2020. The pandemic has pushed the entire world into or near recession. With no engine of growth, the responsibility to ensure the economy avoids a double dip recession rests on Congress. Next, legislation is key to create jobs and prevent recession. Increased tax revenue will fund critical government programs. This comes from Crane in 2020. At a time when Americans need jobs and records need sources of tax revenue, continuing cannabis prohibition is simply economically reckless. According to a recent study by New Frontier Data, national legalization could result in $128.8 billion in tax revenue and an estimated 1.6 million new jobs. While repealing prohibition alone did not end the Great Depression, it provided a substantial portion of the money needed for critical projects that put millions of Americans to work. And last, economic crisis risks global conflict. This comes from Sudaram in 2019. Economic insecurity strengthens national sentiments and increases tensions, especially among the vulnerable. Nationalism may exacerbate tensions, leading to conflicts. Protracted economic distress could lead to military confrontation by the protagonist, even if unintended. Thank you.
Okay, I'll start the timer. Okay, so right now legalization of marijuana is mostly left up to the states. So what's necessary about a federal mandate specifically?
Yeah, so if you look at our FERDIG in 2019 evidence and our ELVS in 2020 evidence from the 1AC, both of them indicate that federal legalization is necessary for the marijuana industry to continue growing. Some of the warrants for this are that it's a lot harder for businesses to make dealings or like make deals with banks or like other companies when it's technically illegal at the federal level for them to be selling marijuana.
Got it. In regards to your cartel's advantage, so you're saying kind of Mexico is on the brink, and the reason that your card says is that there's the most number of deaths in April, but it also says that there's examples of sub-state failure that have been contested for years. So why will that collapse suddenly happen now?
Yeah, so that piece of evidence specifically is talking about how it has been like continuously escalating, and that piece of evidence is from April, but prior to that, it's just continued to escalate. So I think even though it's from April, it's still applicable to the current situation. And if that continues to escalate, then there's sure to be some point where the violence just continues to overtake, and we're gonna see some sort of detriment to the Mexican government.
I got it. And with your econ advantage, your card about marijuana being kind of effective at helping the economy, since then the pandemic has gotten way worse. Like, how could you be sure that just marijuana taxes will be able to overcome all of this like bad negative impact?
Yeah, so one of the cards from the 1AC in the Econ Advantage talks about how congressional, like, like federal mandates are necessary, like federal stimulus is necessary in order to solve the current COVID recession that we have. And the other piece of evidence from that advantage talks about how we would be making $128.8 billion in tax revenue and creating 1.6 million new jobs. So even if it's not completely solving the entire COVID problem, it's still preventing from a collapse, and that's a pretty significant number for both of those.
All right, thank you.
So before we go on with the first negative constructive, which is coming up next, let's kind of talk about what happened there. So the first negative constructive, or the 1AC, just happened. And the 1AC proposed a plan to legalize marijuana, and then said the benefits of that plan were two advantages: the economy advantage, we need tax revenue to help the economy, and then the cartels advantage, which says that we can reduce violence in Mexico by legalizing marijuana and harming the cartel's profits. So you also heard cross-examination, and I want to point out a couple of things that Creedy did. First, she asked about very pointed questions about solvency. And in particular, she was asking why the federal government was necessary. My guess is she was trying to potentially make an argument about whether or not the federal government or the state government could legalize marijuana. And that helps set up her arguments for the first negative constructive. So some other things about the 1NC. The first is that Sucrete has a lot of options, right? She has two disadvantages. She has a critique and she has a counterplan. But she doesn't have time to read all of those and answer the affirmative. So she's going to have to make some choices. The other thing that she's going to do is she needs to both make her case against the plan, off-case arguments, and also answer the potential benefits of the plan, so answer the case arguments made by the affirmative. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to our negative debater for 5 minutes, and we'll see how it goes.
Thanks, Clay. So for this speech, I'll be doing 3 off-case positions, and then I'll be answering the cartel's advantage, and then I'll be going on to answer the economy advantage. First is the federalism disadvantage. First is uniqueness. The states are leading on marijuana despite federal law. That's Zhang in 2020. More than 40 US states could allow some form of legal marijuana by the end of 2020. State lawmakers are teeing up bills. Advocates are racing to collect signatures. Every state could have a marijuana laws on the books that deviate from federal law. Federal ban on marijuana isn't expected to budge. Second is the link. State leadership on marijuana policy is key to federalism, and the plan spills over. That's Roch in 2013. Legalization isn't the first state-federal conflict. It won't be the last. Madison's mechanisms has been largely disabled for decades by the federal government's effective near monopoly on policy. Legalization offers an opportunity to give the constitutional order a tune-up. Allowing for state leadership and regional diversity offers the best prospect of containing conflict, avoiding policy mistakes, and correcting. Third is in the internal link. Federalism is key to solve global warming. That's Graham in 2018. Environmental regulation is an area in which states have some autonomy. These moves set the stage for a wave of independent climate policy by US states. 34 states have climate action plans and aims to play a role in sharing best practices on the international stage. State policies can contribute to global greenhouse gas targets and maintaining confidence in climate agreements. Fourth is the impact. Warming causes extinction. That's Torres in 2016. According to the IPCC, effects of climate change will be irreversible. The consequences will extend longer than the history of human civilization. We would be approaching a sudden, catastrophic collapse. It would result in widespread unrest, economic instability, and elevate the likelihood of nuclear war. It ought to take precedence in the near term. Next off is a state's counterplan. First is the text. The 50 states and relevant territories of the United States of America should legalize marijuana. Second is solvency. State legalization removes key barriers to the industry. That's Mikos in 12. State laws matter. States are able to block federal authorities from imposing sanctions. Federal government does not have resources needed to enforce vigorously. By simply legalizing a given behavior, states can remove most significant barriers in inhibiting that behavior. They now constitute the governing law in 18 states. Medical marijuana has thrived in the shadow of a federal ban. It is the states that have emerged as victors. Supremacy has its limits. Next is the pharmaceutical disad. The pharma industry is strong now. That's Warner in 20. Pharmaceuticals hit all-time highs in May. Investors have plowed hundreds of billions. Biotech stocks have exploded. Moderna industry has outperformed the wider market. Second is the link. The plan destroys the industry. Studies prove legalization would cost billions. That's Wallace in 2017. If legalized, cannabis could siphon more than $4 billion from pharma, could disrupt sales in key treatment areas. In states that legalized, prescriptions declined. If marijuana were legal, taxpayers could save $1.1 billion on prescriptions annually. The annual substitution cost would be $18.5 billion. Third is the internal link. The U.S. is key to global pharmaceutical innovation. That's Powell-Lenny in 18. 74% of medicines in the clinical phase are first-in-class medicines. Novel approaches are being pursued. This vibrant pipeline is due to the biomedical research ecosystem that is among our country's greatest assets. The biopharmaceutical industry greatly outspends government and academia in R&D. The U.S. remains the leader in pharma innovation. Fourth is the impact. Innovation is necessary to fight pandemics, and the impact is billions of deaths. That's Sachs in 2014. Larger and more sudden epidemics are possible, as the 1918 flu. New zoonotic diseases are inevitable, and once a new disease appears, its spread is likely to be rapid. Required medical responses inevitably lag behind emerging diseases. This requires cutting-edge biotechnology to create large-scale responses, such as millions of doses of vaccines, yet each breakthrough leads to the pathogen's mutation. There's a constant arms race. Let's go to the case on the cartel's advantage. First, turn and doesn't solve. The plan causes cartels to diversify, which increases violence. That's Agron in 2018. As states legalize marijuana, cartels are turning to supply and demand. They switch to a more profitable product. Laws allowing marijuana are causing shifts that have caused increases in violence as the cartels move to traffic heroin and meth. Second, no reason now is key. Mexican violence and police corruption has been high for years, and the only evidence they give is highest number of deaths in April. It's not indicative that suddenly there will be now a state collapse. Let's go to the economy advantage. First, the recovery is strong now. Recent data proves that's Nash in 727. U.S. economy rebounded more assertively than expected. In June, nation regained 4.8 million jobs. Labor force participation rate improved, reaching 6.15% in June. ISM index saw activity growth to 52.6%. And when the index surpasses 50, it signals an end to a manufacturing recession. That's it.
Let me start the timer. Okay, so first, isn't legalizing marijuana at the federal level a step in the right direction towards federalism, since we would be aligning with state laws instead of opposing them like we are in the status quo?
So it's not really about aligning. It's more about the fact that, well, it's the fact that actually that they're disaligned right now, which is kind of giving the states some leadership in the sense, because the fact that it's prohibited federally and the states are going ahead and legalizing it, now it's a matter of state law rather than federal law. And that kind of precedence or leadership is what the plan destroys.
Okay. And how can the state's counterplan solve when marijuana would still be illegal at the federal level?
So there's a couple reasons that it would solve. Let's go to the cartel's advantage first. So like it says that your evidence says that the reason that legalization is good is because like people would buy legally and then cartels won't have as much of a demand. And so if all the states legalize, it would still just buy legally within their state. And for the economy advantage, they would still collect all the tax revenue necessary and create the jobs, which are the two internal links mentioned within the economy advantage.
Okay. And then lastly, if the state's counterplan does solve, then doesn't that link into the pharmaceutical disadvantage?
That's a good point. That's true that it links to the pharmaceutical advantage because it would also cause legalization of the whole industry. But I wouldn't go for if I would advocate the state counterplan, I wouldn't also go for the pharmaceutical advantage. And it's kind of saying, even if we did do the plan, the status quo, it's still bad.
Okay, no further questions.
Awesome. So we now kind of have the parameters of the debate have been set, right? We're through the two constructives. The AF has a cartel's advantage and an economy advantage. And then the negative in the 1 and C. Sucrete started off by saying that she had 3 off-case positions, and those 3 off-case positions were the pharmaceutical disadvantage, the state's counterplan, and then the federalism disadvantage. Now, that last question in cross-examination is kind of important because the counterplan, which is an alternative policy, says that the states, the negative advocates, the states should legalize marijuana. But that contradicts, right, the pharmaceuticals disadvantage, which says that any legalization of marijuana at the state or the federal level will harm the industry. And this is the idea that the negative can say, you know, I disagree with whether or not the plan is a good idea, whether or not we should legalize marijuana. But if it is a good idea, there's a different way to do it. And that's the counterplan. So as we go into the first affirmative rebuttal, we have to be thinking strategically. And that's kind of the main difference between a novice and JV debater and a varsity debater. The first is, what's the biggest threat? So Sucrete didn't really spend a lot of time on case. So she may be thinking that the counterplan is a good option. But she also has 2 disadvantages, so she has some different things that she can go for. Also, the affirmative needs to make some choices here. The 1AR is super short, 3 minutes, compared to a 5-minute speech. So Trinity has to jettison something. She can't go for every argument. She needs to make some choice about what her best arguments are. So the other thing that our affirmative debater wants to think about is time allocation. With 3 minutes, you probably want to set some goals for yourself. Like, okay, I want to answer my case arguments in 30 or 40 seconds. Then I want to answer the pharmaceuticals disadvantage, and then some other stuff as well. So assuming that all preparation is done, I'm going to hand it over to our affirmative debater, and we will go through the first affirmative rebuttal. Whenever you're ready.
The 3 reasons you'll be voting for the affirmative in today's debate are that the affirmative reduces cartel violence, improves the state of federalism, and improves the pharmaceutical industry. So first on solvency, the negative team claims that the marijuana industry is already doing well in states that have legalized, so no further action is needed. However, if you look to our Fertig in 2019 evidence from the 1AC that says that states won't be able to succeed on a large scale without federal legalization. Then moving on to the cartel's advantage. The negative team claims that the cartels will switch to other drugs and become more violent. However, marijuana is so profitable that losing that industry will hurt the cartels immensely and reduce their influence significantly. This comes from UNOS in 2014. Marijuana legalization can lead to a decrease in cartel power and hence a decrease in the violence that plagues Mexico. Displacing the cartel marijuana businesses in the United States would be a huge loss to the cartels and would likely shrink their influence and lead to an end of cartel violence. The negative team also claims that now isn't key to prevent collapse. However, our ELVs in 2020 evidence from the 1AC states that violence is escalating now. And if you believe that the plan could reduce that violence through reducing cartel influence, that's enough for the affirmative to garner this advantage. The negative team also tries to claim that failed states don't have an impact. However, their Mazur in 2014 evidence just says that the US can no longer afford to intervene with other countries. It doesn't say that state collapse isn't detrimental, but if you look to our Manwaring evidence from the 1AC, it explicitly describes multiple existential threats that can result from state violence. Then moving on to the economy disadvantage, we'll concede that the economy is recovering now. We're going to kick out of this advantage. Then moving on to the federalism disad. Turn, federal legalization is necessary to restore federalism. This comes from Kafer in 2018. The problem is that state and federal laws conflict in the 8 states that allow recreational use and the more than 24 states that authorize medical marijuana. A change in the federal law would harmonize state and federal enforcement and take a small step towards restoring federalism. So the affirmative plan is actually better overall for federalism in the end. So we also garner federalism as an advantage for the affirmative rather than a disadvantage. Then moving on to the state's counterplan. First, perm do both. There's no reason that the states and the federal government can't legalize at the same time. Second, the counterplan can't solve because federal legislation is key. This comes from Kamen in 2013. The biggest problem is federal law. Given that every marijuana transaction is a federal crime, it's often hard for those in the industry to convince banks to do business with them. It's hard to get investors, it's hard to form any contractual relationship. Continued federal prohibition means that no state government has the power to create legal certainty on its own. Then moving on to the pharma disadvantage. First, this disadvantage is non-unique because the impact they claim to solve for is already happening. They claim that maintaining a strong pharmaceutical industry is key to prevent pandemics. However, we're in the middle of a pandemic right now, which means the pharmaceutical industry wasn't able to stop it, and promoting the affirmative plan isn't going to cause any of these detrimental impacts that they talk about. Also, legal marijuana is the future of the pharmaceutical industry. This comes from Becker in 2014. The new legal markets are offering bigger companies an opportunity. The adoption of cannabis-based medications and products could be the future of the pharmaceutical industry. Not only does the affirmative team prevent cartel violence, the AF also turned both of the negative disadvantage because federal legalization is a step in the right direction towards federalism, and marijuana will be a new sector for the pharmaceutical industry. Thank you.
All right, so we have the negative rebuttal coming up next, which is a 5-minute speech where Sukri will respond to, our negative will respond to some of these arguments. So let's kind of take a moment as she prepares to kind of figure out what's happening in this debate. So the first thing we want to think about is, where is this debate going? And a couple of strategic moves have been made. The first is that the affirmative kicked out of the economy advantage. And what that means is that the affirmative is no longer advancing that argument. So they conceded that the economy advantage didn't make sense. They conceded the negatives arguments. That doesn't mean the negative, or the affirmative, loses the debate. Instead, it means that the advantage is no longer relevant to the debate. So they had 2 advantages. Now they're only advocating for 1. And why? Because the 1AR is super short. Don't have time. The negative also has to make some choices, right? So the negative can advocate for the counter plan, right? And the federalism disadvantage, a counter plan, an alternative policy, and a net benefit, a reason to prefer that policy. They could go for the federalism disadvantage on its own, or they could go for the pharmaceutical disadvantage on its own. So the negative here is going to make some choices. And since we have kind of a pretty even split here with the affirmative and the negative, let's kind of figure out what we want to the negative to go for. Negative has a couple different options, and they're going to have to make some choices. Now, there was a question asked as to whether or not the negative or the affirmative could read evidence and rebuttals. And yes, you can. The negative probably has some more time to read evidence in the negative rebuttal because it's 5 minutes long versus the 1AR, which is fairly short, but you should only be reading evidence when it's absolutely necessary. Remember, your constructives laid the foundations for your arguments. So you've already read a good deal of evidence. Now you have to use it and explain it and compare it to your opponent's evidence in order to win the debate. So anything else I want to talk about? The other thing that Trinity did in the 1AR that was very helpful is she talked about 3 reasons why the judge would be voting affirmative. And she talked about the advantage to the plan, how the affirmative helps federalism, and how the affirmative helps the pharmaceutical industry. Both of which means that the potential disadvantage, the cost of the plan, are now benefits to the plan. So I'm going to turn it over to our negative debater, who's been doing some thinking, has to make some tough choices about what argument to go for. And she is going to write the judge's ballot and try to win the debate for the negative side. Whenever you're ready.
The reason that you'll be voting negative today is that the impact to the federalism dissad is much bigger than any reason that the counter plan doesn't solve the affirmative. The risk of climate change is really high. It causes natural disasters, forced migrations, resource scarcity, and it'll become irreversible soon. So even if the marijuana industry doesn't grow quite as much because, businesses don't have a federal mandate, that is a really small difference compared to risking current climate change, which is why you should vote negative in the end. And the counterplan does solve the affirmative. 1, it solves the cartel's advantage. All states that are legalizing means that cannabis users will turn to the legal industry in their own states. It's no reason that they would still go to the black market if it's legal in their own state. And it's safer and more reliable. And their 1AC Doward evidence even draws upon current legalization in border states to make that argument. That means that the business confidence argument that is made in the next card doesn't really matter because it's clearly they're still growing and flourishing in business and people are still buying from them. Next, they say permutation do both, but that still links to the federalism disadvantage. If the federal and state legalizations happen at the same time, it would be perceived as federal leadership and federal supremacy because we have the supremacy clause in the Constitution, and just there's a general deference to the federal level when they're leading on policy. But it would definitely hamper the perception of state leadership because right now the state policies are really different from the federal policies and they're leading. They say federal legalization is key because of business and investor confidence, but one, all 50 states legalizing would cause enough standardization across states that they would be able to conduct business across states efficiently. And two, sales are high now despite massive economic uncertainty. That was their whole argument in the economy dissad before they kicked out of it, which means that, you know, there's still going to be enough investment into the industry that'll divert enough sales from the Mexican cartel sales, which is their internal link. So if the counterplan is enough to solve, we only have to win a big risk of the disadvantage. So I'm going to go to the pharmaceutical disadvantage now, and I'm going to concede that this disadvantage is non-unique. The fact that we're already in the middle of a pandemic, despite almost pharmaceutical innovation, means that pharmaceuticals isn't effective. And even if the plan somehow helps the pharmaceutical industry, so will the counterplan, because we also legalize in all 50 states. Let's go to the federalism disadvantage. Climate change will soon become irreversible, like I said above, so the time is now to put in climate policies which limit CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions. States are already putting together climate policies which have proven to be effective and signal their leadership in international agreements to give the US credibility on climate. So you shouldn't vote for anything that risks the state legitimacy now, because we're building this legitimacy internationally. And the states are leading now. The affirmative team has not contested the fact that the states have leadership in this area now. They've created competent climate plans which can really help reduce emissions. That's the one I see in saying evidence. They're also winning on marijuana policy now because they have legalized despite federal prohibition as showing leadership. Now let's go to the link debate. And the fundamental question here is whether the plan helps or hurt federalism. Now, their argument for why they help it is because they're harmonizing the policies between the federal and the state government. But our argument is actually the opposite of that, that state leadership is what is driving these climate policies right now. State challenges to federal government and marijuana policy are a healthy expression of federalism, and it shows that the states have independence from federal policy. This is what is pushing them to pursue climate policies now, since the federal government isn't, and means that if they were to marijuana policy would spill over into these other areas. And two, state leadership is key. Defying federal ban restores restores state power. That's Mikos in 2009. States have wielded far more power and influence over marijuana, but it may have been the states that emerged as victors. Marijuana has broader relevance to our understandings of federalism and state resistance to federal authority. In spite of contrary congressional policies, states are merely restoring the state of nature. And now is key. Any threat to state leadership can threaten credibility in climate accords. If it looks like the federal government is taking the lead, international actors do not trust our Congress and the Trump administration to be able to pass effective climate policy. State leadership is thus key to the success of all our global climate agreements. At the end of this debate, you should consider the risks of climate change and ruining our image in international policy against only the small differences in solvency between the plan and the app. The counterplan solves all the advantages of the case, but it totally avoids linking to the disadvantage, and there's a very small difference in solvency that the counterplan can overcome.
So we're finished with the negative rebuttal. The negative has outlined her case against the plan. And that case, we talked about the different options that the negative could go for. In this instance, she chose to kick out of the pharmaceutical disadvantage by conceding that the pharmaceutical industry is obviously not super effective because we're in the middle of the pandemic. So the impact is non-unique. It's already happening. And even if the pharmaceutical industry isn't effective, it doesn't matter because the counterplan links the disadvantage as much as the plan does. So in the second affirmative rebuttal, our affirmative debater is going to have to think about why doesn't the counterplan solve the advantage, and why is the disadvantage not much of a threat? So we talk about costs and benefits. The benefits of the plan are that cartel's advantage, but the magnitude of that is kind of lessened by the fact that the states potentially could solve that advantage. And there's this argument about a balance of power between the state and the federal government. So Just like our negative debater talked about writing the ballot and explaining different reasons why you should vote negative, our affirmative debater is also needing to do some impact calculus explaining why the benefits of the plan outweigh the costs and to explain to the judge why they should vote affirmative. But since there's only 2 minutes, this is going to be a pretty short speech, and the affirmative needs to choose the best arguments in order to make sure that they win the debate. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to our affirmative debater and we'll wrap it up.
To reiterate, the 3 reasons that the affirmative team will be winning today's debate is that first, we decrease cartel violence, second, we uniquely strengthen federalism, and third, we uniquely improve the pharmaceutical industry. So first, on the federalism disadvantage, the affirmative team's plan improves federalism because we're aligning the state and federal laws with each other. The negative team claims that this looks like federal leadership. However, if anything, this looks like states being leaders because they are the ones that have started legalizing first. So then when the federal government follows them, it looks like state leadership. And either way, federalism is all about the balance and both of them working together. So we improve this. That means that we're not going to see any harmful impacts from the federalism disadvantage. We're actually going to garner this as an advantage for the affirmative. We're not going to see these negative impacts of climate change because we are improving federalism through the plan. Then onto the counterplan, they talk about how the counterplan can solve because the states can regulate the industry and the states are already doing so. However, if you look to our FERDIG in 2019 evidence, the federal tax code is against these industries, and it's really hard for marijuana businesses within these states to thrive because they don't receive stimuli from the government and because the tax code is against them. So we need federal regulation in order to allow the marijuana industries to thrive. And that's why the affirmative solves better than the counterplan, because these businesses will be at maximum efficiency when they don't have the federal government against them and they're able to make business dealings. Then onto the pharmaceutical disadvantage. The negative tries to kick out of this, however, they can't because the affirmative is garnering this as an advantage. And the counterplan doesn't solve for it because of the things that I talked about on the federalism disadvantage, that the tax code is against the state industries. And so the affirmative plan is going to solve this disadvantage better and improve the pharmaceutical industry more because they'll be able to thrive better. So again, just to reiterate, we're not going to see these negative impacts of climate change because we're actually going to be preventing it with the affirmative, and we're going to be reducing cartel violence and improving the pharmaceutical industry. Thank you.
All right. So big thanks to our 2 participants for debating. What we'd now like to do is to give y'all an opportunity to vote and see what you thought of the debate. So let's see who won. Okay. So by a bit of a margin here, we have the affirmative wins 80% of the popular vote. But there's also a couple of interesting things that I think we should talk about. The first is this idea of the pharmaceutical disadvantage, right? Because the negative said, hey, we're not talking about that anymore. This doesn't matter because the impact is non-unique. But the affirmative kind of talked about how maybe it's still an advantage for them. There's also a question as to whether or not the counterplan, the alternative policy, will help create a marijuana industry where the states or the federal government should do it. And then there's a question as to whether or not the plan is state leadership, the federal government surrendering to the states, or whether or not it's federal overreach. So there's a lot of questions that we still kind of have at the end of the debate. So what I want to open it up to is to ask some questions about the participants, to question the participants even, and see what their thoughts on the debates were. So I'll start off with my first question, which is, what was your strongest argument? And if you won, what would the ballot say? Let's start with the negative first, since the affirmative just spoke. So what was your strongest argument? If you won, what would the ballot say?
I would say that the strongest argument is that the ballot would say that the counterplan solves the affirmative's impacts, and the difference between the counterplan and the affirmative is so small that it doesn't outweigh the larger risk of the federalism disadvantage and climate change.
And then Trinity?
I would say that the strongest piece of the affirmative arguments is that the affirmative just solves everything better. Like it stops the federalism disad better. It solves the advantages of the plan better, and it solves the pharmaceutical disad better.
Okay, so in contrast to that, it's kind of a question of solvency, right? Because there's no case defense at the end. So there's no arguments against that advantage necessarily. The argument instead is that we have two different options to resolve the problem of Mexican drug cartels. So let's go to the flip side. What was your weakest argument? And if you lost, what would the ballot say?
Probably one version could be like somehow the deficit to the counterplan, the necessity of federal legalization is more important than kind of the risk to the disadvantage. And that would mean that, there's not really a big risk that this federalism disadvantage would go on, because maybe it helps federalism a little bit, and maybe it's not really going to take down all these states' climate policies.
I think the hardest thing is on the like cartels advantage. I think the argument about how the cartels will switch to like more violent or like harder drugs or more violent acts of like business is a really compelling argument. Yeah, I think that advantage is like kind of hard because of that.
Okay. So we do have some questions about the pharmaceutical disadvantage. I know that kicking arguments kind of seems counterintuitive, right? Because you're like, hey, here's this good argument. I think it's awesome. And then the next speech, you're like, whoa, I don't think that anymore. So maybe let's start with the negative, who kind of brought it up. What were you doing with the pharmaceutical disadvantage in the 1NC? And then what were you trying to do in the negative rebuttal? And then for the affirmative, what were you doing in the 1AR? And then what were you doing in the 2AR?
So in the 1NC, I wanted to give myself kind of a couple of options. So I could either go for the state's counterplan and the federalism disad, because the state's counterplan does not link to the federalism disadvantage. But if I wanted to go for the pharmaceutical disadvantage, then I would not be going for the state's counterplan because that links. So I just gave myself some options towards the end of the debate. But when you're explaining it as a debater, you can say, like I kind of explained at the beginning, we think that the plan is a bad idea. So we think the plan is a bad idea because of the pharmaceutical advantage. And even if you think that the pharmaceutical advantage isn't a big deal, there's still a better way to do it, which is the state's counterplan, because it avoids this other big disadvantage to the plan, federalism.
And then, am I supposed to say what I was doing with the Pharma Disadvantage?
Yeah. So how did it become an advantage, like you said in the 2AR?
Yeah, so basically, I read in the 1AR a piece of evidence that turned the advantage or turned the disadvantage. And that piece of evidence said that basically, when we legalize marijuana federally, this is going to strengthen the pharmaceutical industry, because the pharmaceutical industry is going to have a whole new like set of products that they can sell basically. And so we're not going to see any like negative impacts. We're actually going to see positive impacts to the pharmaceutical industry. So then I use this as like just another benefit on top of the advantages of the affirmative.
Okay, so 2 more questions and then we'll open it up. What was your thought process going into the final rebuttals? What arguments were you most worried about?
I mean, I feel like the thought process was mostly just make sure to hit hard on the solvency deficits when I'm going on the counter plan and really explain how I solve each part of the advantage, because since I'm kind of banking on the counter plan to be able to solve everything and not even going to the case arguments, I'm not even debating their case at all. I'm just saying the counter plan solves everything. So I really want to make sure that, yes, it actually does solve everything. So I would go say like, oh, like right now, their evidence says that state legalization is solving, and that's the reason for why legalization will help solve in general. So I would mention that because then it kind of strengthens my argument. So that was kind of where I was going with that. And then I wanted to not spend extra time on case defense now and spend more time on developing the federalism link, because now I don't need case defense. So I really picked that I'm going for the counter plan, not worrying about case.
For me, the biggest thing was probably just like the counter plan, and trying to prove that the affirmative solves better than the counter plan, and like using that argument on both of the disadvantages as well to say that the federal government is better at like proving all of these advantages, or like garnering all these advantages, than the counter plan.
Okay, so one last question before we open it up. And if you're watching this live, then you'll have the opportunity to ask some questions, and our wonderful participants will answer them. So the last question is, as you prepare for the debate, you read over the evidence, stuff like that, what is one tip for someone who's trying to debate your side and win the debate? Let's start with the negative.
Yeah, so is it just any tip to win generally on the negative, or this specific debate?
This specific, if you're debating the marijuana affirmative and you're negative,
Sure.
what is a tip for someone debating your side?
Okay, yeah, I would say that make sure you understand, like I said, the internal links of the affirmative. And by this, I mean, like, how does specifically the affirmative solve each of their advantages? So when you're explaining your counter plans, et cetera, you can do that specifically in the context of what the affirmative evidence has said. The affirmative evidence has solved, not just because they say they solve, because they say that legalization will take away buyers. And then you can use that same exact thing for your counter plan. So really digging into those same internal links. And then again, deciding what kind of, another small tip is just deciding what advantage is stronger to you. I feel like the counter plan is actually harder for it to solve the economy advantage because of that tax revenue thing. So like really making sure you know where your weaknesses are so you're prepared to debate them.
I would say similar things, I guess. Definitely like think about which advantage you think is better, because there's not a lot of time in the 1AR. So you'll probably have to kick out of one of them. So think about which ones you're the most comfortable with. And then also really hammer in like why the federal government is necessary, because that's going to be the main thing that keeps the negative from winning on the counter plan in the end.